I'm going to try to stick to the schedule at least somewhat, so that the next presenter will have enough time. Good afternoon. My name is Synnestvedt. I'm a associate professor of philosophy here at Synnestvedt College of the New Church. And a few years ago, we had a symposium to honor the 250th anniversary of the Last Judgment, which took place in the spiritual world. And several presenters gave papers, and then those papers were turned into a book. And my talk to you today is based on my chapter in the book, The World Transformed. But it goes further than that chapter, so I have some new, fresh material for you. And so the title is Unmasking Naturalism, the Science Wars and Freeing the Spirit. And I also have printouts down here of the slideshow, if you want them. So this talk is going to be in 3 parts. Part 1 is going to be about unmasking naturalism. Part 2 is going to be a quick summary of the science wars. And the third part is going to address freeing the spirit. The main point of my talk is this. The conventional view is that peoples of Western culture have largely freed themselves from the restrictions and dogmas of religion, especially Christianity. This began in the 18th century, when reason, especially scientific reason, criticized sacred writ, theology, the church, and dared to offer counter-explanations for everything from the solar system and the development of human beings on Earth to morality, politics, and religiosity itself in naturalistic terms. A certain segment of Western intelligentsia, postmodernists primarily, claims that while we have successfully avoided the Scylla of religion, we have not avoided the Charybdis of science. Thus we have the cultural moment known as the science wars. These so-called wars are motivated, at least in part, by the desire to be free, to not be imprisoned by a false objectivity and dictatorial disciplines, and to be recognized as intellectual equals. The postmodern solution to this predicament is to assert that we invent reality and that nothing should function as a god or ultimate narrative. I believe that this proposed solution is illogical and impractical. Now, I won't argue for that here, but we can discuss it during the question and answer session if you like. So, what will free the human spirit? In one sense, the human spirit has already been freed. And several chapters in The World Transformed confirm this by discussing the origins of the anti-slavery movement, the emancipation of women, the promotion of childhood as a state of innocence, and the profoundly liberating discoveries in modern mathematics and science. In another sense, though, a new form of theism and spirituality is needed to realize this freedom. So let's move on to part 1, unmasking naturalism. I want to make 3 distinctions, and this is common in the philosophical literature. So there's one kind of naturalism known as methodological naturalism, and this is what I was trying to get after Ian Thompson about. And that's the idea that when studying natural phenomena, we should only appeal to or use natural forces, natural entities, and natural causes. And this is some philosophers anyway, and many scientists would just say this is the scientific method. this methodological naturalism. It just is science. And so, for example, if there is an earthquake and a resulting tsunami, instead of appealing to, let's say, the wrath of God, as happened in the 18th century, both in Jamaica and in Portugal, to explain the earthquake and the tsunami, methodological naturalism says instead we should try to explain that phenomena using ideas of forces, natural forces, and how things are related to each other through causes and effects. So, although they didn't have these theories back in the 18th century, but today we would talk about plate tectonics, the movement of plates, and fluid dynamics, which is a branch of physics, and that would explain the earthquake and the tsunami, not the wrath of God, in other words. So that's one kind of naturalism, methodological naturalism. The second one is ontological naturalism, which has to do with reality, okay? If you're an ontological naturalist, in the positive sense, you believe that everything that is or that exists is natural. Okay, that's a positive way of putting it. So any kind of being you can think of, any kind of force, any kind of event, phenomena, object is natural. That's the positive side of ontological naturalism. The negative side is to say that there is nothing that can be supernatural or transcendental. So that rules out God, if God is a spirit or a supernatural entity. It rules out angels, devils, demons, archangels, minds, if they are supernatural or transcendental entities. Okay? So that's commonly called the negative version of ontological naturalism. And then thirdly, epistemological naturalism. So epistemology means knowledge. That's the view that whatever we know through science. Okay? And as we already said in the first definition, methodological naturalism, the way to gain knowledge of things is by applying the natural method. So looking for natural causes and effects and developing theories based on those, developing ways of testing those, hypotheses, and etc. Okay? So epistemological naturalism says this is the most sure way to gain knowledge. If something counts as a bit of knowledge, it's because it was generated by means of the sciences. Now we can actually go, and people do go one step further than that. There's another term called scientism. Scientism. And scientism is very similar to this epistemological naturalism. But it goes a little step further and basically says anything that doesn't have, doesn't use the methods of science actually can't count as a field of knowledge. Okay? And so the only way to meaningfully answer questions is by using scientific methods. Right? So the most valuable, the most important kinds of questions that we have, even if they're not currently answered by science, they will be answered by science and should be answered by science. And so even if something currently isn't a field of science, if you have an academic like the philosopher of science, Daniel Dennett, up at Tufts University, he says, well, even if something isn't currently a field of science, it should become a field of science. And his goal, for example, is to turn religion into a field of science. Okay, so these are the three kinds of naturalism that it's helpful to keep in mind. So, as a scientist and a philosopher, Swedenborg used methodological naturalism, right? He was a scientist. He used the scientific method and knew the scientific method. However, he argued against ontological naturalism and epistemological naturalism. He also revealed their causes and consequences while unmasking the presence of naturalism in what one might think a rather unlikely host. And that is the first Christian church. Now, this work was essential for freeing the human spirit from the domineering established Catholic and Protestant churches of the 18th century. And while I'm happy to report that some Christians in the U.S. are aware of the dangers of epistemological and ontological naturalism and have written books critical of them, they still seem somewhat blind to the causes of naturalism within Christian theology and practice. The theology that helps produce naturalism is the doctrine of salvation by faith alone, because it makes no account of repentance, the Ten Commandments, and works of charity. And the practice that helps produce naturalism is the lack of a methodology for repentance in life and reformation of character. At this time of the judgment on the first Christian church in the mid-18th century, Swedenborg reports that the hells grew because outwardly pious Christians were concealing their inwardly selfish materialistic lives. And these people were naturalists. They weren't philosophically sophisticated naturalists, but they lived in such a way so as to consistently deny the reality of God in the spiritual world. They were ontological naturalists in life, whether they were conscious of such a label or not. And as intellectuals found then, and many people have found today, epistemological naturalism is a great support for ontological naturalism and certain forms of life. Now, in my article in the book, I review some arguments in favor of naturalism and several recent arguments against naturalism. So I look forward to chatting about those with Ian later on as he works on his book on the new church and atheism. But let me just tell you one of the strategies that naturalists use, and it's pretty simple. They link the unquestionable results of science with naturalism so strongly that to question naturalism is to also question science. And so if you question the former, you're questioning, if you question the latter, you're questioning the former, and to do so is absurd, right? Because who questions science nowadays? But there are two drawbacks to this otherwise effective marketing strategy. One is the existence of legitimate scientists who are not naturalists, but who are instead theists or deists. So you take Robert Boyle from the very beginnings of modern science back in the 17th century, or someone like Francis Collins, who worked on the Human Genome Project and is a theist, or Ian Thompson, who seems well-credentialed, right, and working in a well-known physics lab. The other drawback to this strategy is the disdain for other views and the authoritarianism associated with the linkage between naturalism and science. And this brings us to the so-called science wars. So what are the science wars? Well, they are debates among intellectuals over the status, role, and claims of science and scientists in contemporary society. Now, scientists have been criticized, or aspects of science have been criticized from both the left and the right. So conservatives, for example, such as Philip E. Johnson, have criticized Darwinian biologists for proposing wildly inadequate evolutionary explanations for phenomena that seem to be products of intelligent design. And people such as Dr. Duane Gish have criticized the theory of evolution from the perspective of a young Earth creationist. So these are people who believe that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, and they believe that on the basis of their reading of the Bible. Now, from the political left, Social constructivists, such as Bruno Latour, and postmodernists, such as Donna Haraway, criticize scientists for presenting their findings as if they were the objective truth, rather than the result of processes biased by money, politics, language, and gender. The social constructivists assert that scientists do not discover facts. Instead, they produce or invent facts. And these are artifacts of their social and linguistic conventions based on their particular communities. So here's an example to illustrate what's going on. So instead of assuming that modern Western natural science is true, and then wondering why backward ethnic groups still practice witchcraft, Bruno Latour turns the tables on this standpoint by approaching a group of scientists, studying them as a foreign tribe, and he analyzes their behavior and beliefs through anthropological categories. And what he discovers, or realizes, is that the scientific facts or truth that they believe that they are coming up with are generated by intersubjective agreement among the tribe. Okay? So just as the Zande believe that the chicken died because there was black magic at work or witchcraft at work, and they agree that that's the case because there's a shaman and then there are other elders and so forth, and they agree that that's what happened. So the tribe of scientists that Bruno Latour studied in the lab, he says it's the same thing that's going on there, okay? And that's what's generating scientific truth. So you also have postmodern literary critics who assert that scientific reasoning is just another form of discourse, no more objective or rational than any other form of discourse. Now, the debate became really heated in public when in 1996, Alan Sokol, a physicist at NYU, submitted an article titled "Transgressing the Boundaries Toward a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity." How's that sound? And he submitted it to the postmodern journal Social Text. Now, the editors did not notice that the article was full of nonsense from the standpoint of physics, and so they published it. Sokol then announced in a different journal called Lingua Franca that his Social Text article was a hoax, written to expose the absurdity of much postmodern cultural analysis. And then there are articles and accusations back, just the internet lit up, amongst all the academics. Now, the defenders of science might not understand the formidable vocabulary used by the postmodern critics, but they do understand that the postmodernists aim to cut science down to size and to debunk scientific authority. Now, what do these critics from both the left and the right have in common? Well, they point out that science is a contingent human endeavor, not a monolithic machine of necessity. And what inspires their criticism is the sense that some scientists have a strong desire to control other people, control the debate, and certain aspects of life to the point that a monoculture is produced that reflects their image and likeness. And the critics respond to the lack of equality among cultural institutions, the lack of understanding among scientists for perspectives radically different from their own, the lack of freedom that accompanies the presentation of scientific truth, and often the lack of participation regarding decisions on social policy and scientific investment. Now, I grant that there's a lot of scientific and mathematical illiteracy among the postmodern critics. But likewise, it seems to me that there's a fair amount of philosophical illiteracy among the scientific critics of postmodernism. Now, the Sokol hoax took place back in the mid-90s. And one might have predicted that an era of peace would ensue after this big brouhaha. However, the attacks upon religion by the new atheists have actually provoked new battles about science, and not just from the political right, from religious conservatives, but actually from fellow atheists. So, for example, there's a book called The Science Delusion by Curtis White, and it's named after Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And another book called The Devil's Delusion by the secular Jew David Berlinski. Curtis White's thesis is that the message of neuroscience advocates is much the same as that of the new atheists, namely, submit, confess to the superiority of science and reason. And this message is sent not only to evangelicals, but also to another historical adversary, namely art, philosophy, and the humanities. Against the ideology of scientism and, quote, its social regimentation, economic exploitation, environmental destruction, and industrial militarism, Curtis writes to rehabilitate the poorly understood tradition of romanticism. Now, Berlinski's aim is to deflate the scientific pretensions of the new atheists, especially when it comes to cosmological physics and evolutionary biology, and the assertion that people must choose between religion and the allegedly rock-solid findings of science. Approvingly, he quotes physicist Alexander Vilenkin's observation that, quote, sadly, quantum cosmology is not likely to become an observational science. Correct, writes Berlinski. Quantum cosmology is a branch of mathematical metaphysics. Philosophy. He shows that some scientists develop and support theories or repress dissenting views primarily for philosophical, that is, religious or anti-religious, not scientific reasons in both physics and biology. White's and Berlinski's books add support to the sociological view that the new atheism is actually a part of a contemporary crisis of authority. Now, there's another atheist I want to mention, Massimo Pigliucci. His thesis is that the new atheism is marked by a turn toward scientism. He maintains that, quote, such a move has been a bad one for public atheism for three reasons. One, scientism is philosophically unsound. Two, scientism does a disservice to science. Three, scientism does a disservice to philosophical atheism. Instead of this new turn in atheism, taken by Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, and others, Pigliucci counsels a more holistic approach to knowledge. So, that's the science wars, okay? And it's more subtle than just left and right, but I'm just trying to give you a broad overview here, okay? So let's move on to the last part. Freeing the spirit. And it was interesting, I just Googled in Google images, free spirit, and it's interesting that some of the things that come up are birds, like eagles, soaring, and horses, which, if you understand the symbolism of that, right, this is, an unfettered understanding, particularly one that is looking at things from a spiritual perspective. So, anyway, in the 18th century, Swedenborg showed that Christian piety was a mask for naturalism, and that naturalism at its heart was a love of the world and of self, especially the love of ruling for the sake of self and the world, above the love of God and the common good. Now, like some of his contemporaries, Swedenborg said that Christian piety as such was evil because it was hypocritical, and it had to be exposed for the good of humanity. But unlike some of his contemporaries, Swedenborg's solution to this problem was not to get rid of Christianity or get rid of religion because, quote, we tried it and it didn't work. And so now we have to replace that with science. Instead, Swedenborg points us in the direction of finding a useful relationship between Christianity and science. Naturalism is being unmasked today by its many critics from both the left and the right. Ontological and epistemological naturalists, we find, often hide behind methodological naturalism. They assert that methodological naturalism is ontologically neutral when clearly it's not, because, right, remember, methodological naturalism says you have to explain things in terms of natural causes, natural events, natural forces, natural objects, etc. Okay? And that's a useful tool, but that's not ontologically or metaphysically neutral, right? It's saying you can only use natural things to do this. So, even though the critics from, I think, the left, the postmodernists, are wrong to take an anti-realist stance, I think there is really reality out there, and I think we can find real truth. I think they are right to show that science is a human endeavor. It's conducted by finite beings. They produce limited and potentially fallible results. I think Swedenborg's work is essential for freeing the human spirit from the controlling grasp of naturalism. Both Swedenborg and the history of science show that scientific research can be conducted by people who are religious, who are theists, and by people who are non-religious, who are atheists. They also show that scientific findings can be used to support a theistic worldview and a naturalistic worldview. Scientists won't be free of criticism until the non-scientists, I think, perceive the respect that they feel they are due in a more egalitarian ethos, and until they perceive the freedom to interpret the meaning of scientific facts for themselves and the significance of their own lives. In short, the human spirit, I think, won't be free until we create this kind of space and respect these various modes of knowing. So, not just science, but intuition, for example, or artistic modes of knowing. So a kind of epistemological pluralism. And we create the space for a spiritual worldview. Okay, some kind of theism, for example, such as New Church theism. Ultimately, I think, because, as Swedenborg says, there are things that the human soul knows. And one of those things is that there is the greatest spirit of all, and that's God. Thank you very much. So, we have some time for questions and answers, if you like. I think the next talk starts at 3. George?
I'll take one on the end.
Sure.
Great presentation, thank you. And I love the coverage of the challenge from the left and the challenge from the right to scientism. And I'm wondering about your thoughts on the perception that perhaps there is also the challenge from within. Because, for example, in physics, we've had 100 years of quantum physics, and nobody can understand it because it's riddled with paradoxes. So it doesn't meet the standard of being able to be explainable away. So, Lee Smolin wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Trouble with Physics. He's talking about all of these issues of academic, obstructionism. And yet he's an ardent materialist.
Yeah.
So
That, oh yeah, that's a great question. So the question was about the kind of unraveling, perhaps, of naturalism or scientism from within the sciences themselves. And there's two interesting things I want to say about that. One is that with these science wars, just put the image of the cannons back up here again. With the science wars, and this is, I think, is true of any group, right? If you're part of a group and you're under attack, one of the things that you do is band together for safety and security, right? You circle the wagons, and you don't, even though I might disagree with you, we're going to agree enough because we have a common enemy in those people over there. So that's one of the things that goes on during these science wars. Like, well, I mean, when it comes right down to things like funding and whether the United States is going to get a superconducting supercollider, for example, which we didn't get, instead Europe got it. I mean, these are the things that really matter to scientists doing this kind of research, and they know that to get big funding like that, you got to build support. You have to have an advertising campaign, and what you don't want is scientists bickering with each other over various things, and then letting creationists or intelligent designers or people like that coming in and driving wedges and splitting things apart and saying, well, see, we don't need to spend big dollars on that sort of stuff, on funding that kind of research. So I think that's one of the phenomena that we've seen go on, that I think patches things up, at least temporarily, in some cases. The other thing that happened about 10 years ago, maybe it was more like 11 or 12, is so we had the Sokal hoax when Alan Sokal, a physicist, produces this gets his paper published in Social Text, and it's just a bunch of baloney, but the postmodernists, it gets through their sieve. So about 8 years later, there's a pair of French popularizers of science, the Bogdanov brothers, and they're working on their PhDs, but they don't quite have them. And they make a deal with their advisor at the university, and their advisor says, well, if you manage to get some articles, some of your research published as articles in physics journals, then we'll probably grant you your PhD. So these two brothers, they are dealing with quantum mechanics and very fringy cosmological stuff, but they managed to get their papers published, one in the Annals of Physics and the other one in a journal that's quantum gravity and something, I forget what else. But two, reputable, respectable journals. And so a couple of physicists read these, and they think, these articles are junk. Have the postmodernists hoaxed us? Right? Are they firing their cannon back at us? Because, look what got through the editors of these two fairly prestigious journals. Instead, that wasn't the case. It was just, shoddy editorial review. And the Bogdanov brothers, eventually it comes out that, these two brothers, they're trying to get their degrees, there was sloppy academic oversight and whatnot. But, for a while there, the email was going around and people were, well, who said they could do this? Well, use that guy over there, and this was the referee, and who endorsed these two brothers? And here's a lot of finger pointing going on. And so that's a nice case of where you do see some of the unraveling, because then the brothers said, well, wait a minute, we're trying to float new ideas out there, and it's just you guys are so sensitive to the political and social atmosphere right now that you're not willing to entertain new thoughts. And basically the response was, shut up and go away. And we just need to carry on with what we're doing. So there's a couple. So yeah, I think there is some unraveling going on inside, and certainly there's also and I haven't kept up with this, but this is probably about now 1996 or so. Sort of around the same time, I remember reading about the United States actually thinking of developing a branch of the federal government called the Science Court. Anybody ever hear this? The Science Court? Because the thought was that you have expert witnesses that would come in and provide testimony at trials, and sometimes you have very technical scientific issues at stake in determining liability, for example. And basically the courts were getting fed up with the prosecution hiring their expert scientific witness, and then the defense hiring their expert scientific witness, and the two experts not agreeing with each other. And so they floated this idea of, well, actually maybe we should have a branch of the federal government that would determine what the truth was about some scientific topic, which would then make it easier for us to resolve these legal cases. How's that grab you? So now I haven't kept up with it, so I don't know I don't think it really went anywhere. I don't think it ever got funded or things like that. But that also is a little more evidence to this kind of internal unraveling, but it's obviously tied up with politics too. Jane?
Yeah, I'm interested in your last example, and whether you may not know the answer to this, but were the brothers actually floating new, I'm now going to say useful, challenging ideas, or were they really just shoddy physicists or whatever, and therefore deserve to be condemned? Because it makes a difference in terms of your story, it seems to me, as to whether or not they were legitimately plowing new ground and got put down, or whether they really just weren't very adequate in terms of their scholarship.
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't read their papers, and I think even if I did, I wouldn't be able to answer your question about whether they were doing legitimate physics or not. And the physicists that I read about disagreed. So you had some physicists in France saying, oh no, this is new and interesting work, and we think it should continue to be circulated amongst the public. And then you had another group saying, no, this is terrible, it's shoddy, it just is a bunch of words and equations and stuff cobbled together from other sources, and it doesn't really hang together and produce something new. So
did they get their PhDs? Things like that matter in terms of the overall conversation, which I think you're making a legitimate conversation, but the example kind of matters to me, because if it's shoddy, that's one thing. If it's really kind of new and being quashed, that's a totally different sort of thing. And maybe fortunately,
do you know the answer?
You know that Lee Smolin's book goes into this at some length about the pressures in academia in physics, theoretical physics, that anybody that was doing anything other than string theory, they didn't want to talk to. You couldn't get in a program, you couldn't get a degree, because there was so much insularity built into the academic environment at that point. And you had to be somebody who already had credentials, like Lee Smolin, in order to be able to get away with saying that.
Right.
The academic discipline was very, very driven towards that goal. So, good luck.
We have another question or comment?
Comment, hopefully. You want to go first? might want to consider, it's very tricky, in my opinion, somewhat reformed. It's a very tricky issue, and I suggest consider Boltzmann. Boltzmann, I believe, formed the first solid theory of thermodynamics, perhaps the second most important theory of physics, as I've heard it described in grade. And in 1880, after a series of a couple of articles and whatnot, don't know exactly how it communicated and published, but he was at the University of Cambridge. In 1887 or thereabouts, when his theories headed, and he received rather severe criticism from a lot of the top physicists. And this went on for 19 years. When he was on vacation with his family in Italy one summer, 1906, at some point there and going home, committed suicide. And this is kind of significant. Another ramification, just to the side, Wittgenstein would have gone to the University and studied physics, but for that fact, as he went to Berlin and studied mechanical engineering, ended up at the University of Manchester, got patents, aircraft engines, and studied at Cambridge for additional mathematics, and ended as philosopher, studied with Bertrand Russell. And so, anyway, but Boltzmann committed suicide as a result, and science later accepted, and he wasn't aware of it, I don't know, Josiah Gibbs at Yale came up with a slightly different mathematical approach and made it more elegant or whatever, and sort of confirmed his approach, yet he ended up 2 years later committing suicide. So it's really tragic. Yeah, I'm not saying he was going to commit suicide, but you don't know.
Well, he did the groundwork for Einstein, Boltzmann's equation, with basically the groundwork for Einstein.
Yes.
Relativity.
And well, in some sense, I suppose. I'm not a physicist. I reviewed that data a long time ago, but another consideration, there's been advanced since then in complex dynamic systems theory, so-called CAD dynamics or whatever. But the Brigadine's Nobel Prize winning for it. But regardless, Boltzmann was an important figure.
Yeah, and I think the idea of the person with the new theory being ostracized or not being accepted, I think that's well confirmed.
If I may just add a little bit to Brigidine's work. The point is science, top scientists know that their work will be superseded at some point in the future. They don't know when. So Newton's really was more or less superseded 214, whatever, starting with the special theory of relativity. So scientists sort of know that at some point their theory is going to be shown as almost entirely wrong, significantly wrong, or totally thrown out like Aristotle's, Aristotle, Ptolemaic.
So yeah, I think the idea of the new idea or the groundbreaker or the pioneer being kind of ostracized or not accepted has been confirmed through the studies of the history and sociology of knowledge and science in particular. And the insularity that George mentioned is still in play too. Jane, I did in one article I read, they checked to see if the brothers' articles had been referenced by other physicists, and they hadn't.
Okay.
And so now you can either take that as well, that shows that their work was bogus because no one else is picking up on it, or it's a symptom of the insularity of the community that they just won't use it or won't acknowledge it. I think maybe we have time for maybe one more. Was it? I don't know.
I was seeing the example. I didn't think was loses value. It was still highlighting potentially some paranoia. There was some sensitivity in the response. If you were emailing and saying, "Are we being hoaxed or scammed?"
Yeah.
To some degree, for this discussion, it doesn't matter whether it was shoddy workmanship or something that was before its time in terms of innovation. The response was what you were highlighting. So.
Yeah, thanks. Angela, did you have a question or comment?
Could you go to your next slide with the horse and the eagle? Yeah, so the need to respect various modes of knowing, and you mentioned an artistic mode of knowing, and perhaps
Artistic?
yes.
Yeah.
Contemplative inquiry. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how New Church higher education can be supportive of other modes of knowing.
Well, I think just by, so the question is about new church higher education, how can we support other modes of knowing? I think one is just by continuing to maintain strong distribution requirements. So not privileging one discipline or one set of disciplines over the others. So, we have an aesthetic requirement right now, and that's a good thing. Just making sure that students get some exposure to various disciplines in the way that they engage in research and trying to know and understand the world and ourselves in it. I think the other thing too actually is the strong religion requirements. Because while religion, particularly studying the heavenly doctrines, there's a lot of reasoning, there's argumentation, but there are also extended appeals to imagination in the heavenly doctrines, and there are extended appeals to experience. At certain points, Sweetwater just says, "Well, you go and try this, and then come back, and we'll keep reading about it." And I think at other points, he just admits, he says, "Well, there aren't any words, and I can't really convey this to you, so I'll try a few things, and maybe something will stick, but it probably won't. But we'll try anyway." So you can see there, he's calling out the limits, of language, the limits of our standard modes of knowing, and I think even when he talks about, there's a kind of rationality to nature and to creation, and there's a kind of logic to it. As Ian said, it comes back to, well, what is this logic? Why does math work? Why is it reasonable? It's because there's a pattern to love. And so we see the pattern and we think, oh, the pattern is it, but actually it's the pattern of love. Well, can you fully understand love? No. Why? Because the understanding is a form of love, and so the love is kind of deeper than the understanding. And so I think if you accept that very beginning, that deep metaphysical, ontological principle that love is the life of a human being, and that thought is the first effect of that life, of that love, then I think there should be a built-in kind of humility and willingness to honor various modes of knowing. That it should extend right to, I didn't really get into the feminist critique of science, but that's also from the left, typically, although there are women philosophers of science and women scientists who have responded to that. So I don't think it's fair to say, oh, if you're a feminist, then you must be from the left and you must be critical of science. I don't think that's true. But there are some feminists who have said, for example, what scientists call objectivity is just male subjectivity. Okay, so, but I think, again, if you look at the kinds of religion, new church theology in particular, when it talks about there are complementary aspects to men and women, but men and women are not the same. And it comes right down to not just their affections, but also the way they know. So women's perception, the book Marriage, Love, or Conjugal Love tells us, is something that men aren't capable of. So that means that women have a way of knowing things that men apparently don't have that knowledge, that epistemic mode. But it might also be the case that men have a mode or a way of knowing things that women don't have. I don't know. I don't know for sure. But so I think that too, that idea of valuing the creation of both men and women and honoring what they both have to bring, and that extends right from the secondary schools that we have, a girls' school and a boys' school. They're not the same schools, although they're complementary. Okay, right up on through the college too. So, thank you very much for staying, and